All right, let's jump into this deep dive. We're going to be looking at excerpts from Dov Seidman's How W. It's a pretty fascinating look at leadership, especially, in today's world where everything's so fast-paced and connected.
Yeah, Seidman's work, it's really as relevant as ever, I think. He talks about this concept of a how W world, which is really, it goes beyond just ethics. It's about the very core of leadership and what it really means to be successful in this world where transparency is everything.
And one of the first things that really jumped out at me was his take on Danny Meyer's idea of a hospitality economy. I mean, what makes that different from just, a service economy?
Yeah, it's a subtle shift, but it's really powerful.
Yeah.
You can think of service as kind of like a monologue. We decide what good service looks like, and then we deliver that. But hospitality, it's more like a dialogue. It's about really listening to what the other person needs and responding in a way that makes them feel valued.
So it's not just about, checking off boxes or following a script. It's about, really connecting with the other person.
Exactly. And Seidman argues that, this goes way beyond just customer service. How can you bring that kind of hospitality mindset to your work or to your relationships or really any other part of your life?
Yeah, I can see how that would completely change the dynamic, even with my team at work. Seidman also, he challenges some of those kind of established business ideas in the book. He questions, those core ideologies, like innovation and customer service or even winning that Jim Collins and Jerry Porras talk about. What's his issue with those?
Well, he argues that, in a HW world, you can't just DO those things. They're not actions, they're result. It's kind of like trying to be happy. If you just chase the feeling, you miss the point.
So it's more about focusing on the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. Instead of focusing on those results, we need to look at the underlying values that drive those results. Things like trust and integrity, transparency, fairness. Those are the real foundation for excellence.
And he makes this point that it's even more crucial now because of the internet.
Yeah.
Everything's so visible. It's like that example with the kryptonite bike lock.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect example. One small design flaw gets exposed online, and it had a huge impact on their reputation. It shows you why, really doing values matters because inconsistency gets exposed so quickly. Building trust, it takes time, but breaking it can happen in a second.
It makes you realize, there's no room for shortcuts anymore.
Absolutely. And that leads us to Seidman's leadership framework, which I think is really fascinating. It's not like your typical how to be the boss's kind of guide. It goes much deeper than that.
Yeah, I got a little glimpse of it in the excerpts, and there were a few attributes that really stood out to me, particularly, Seidman's focus on seizing authority and taking responsibility. It's like that story he tells about Steve Wynn, the casino magnate.
Yeah, Wynn found this mistake in his employees' compensation, and, it would have been easy to just ignore it, but he chose to address it head on, even though it cost him a significant amount of money. It's a great example of how, honesty, even when it's tough, it builds that long-term trust.
It's a lesson that a lot of leaders could learn from.
Absolutely. And then there's this contrast between charismatic authority and formal authority, which I think is one of Seidman's most insightful ideas. He uses this story of a Japanese kamikaze pilot who actually dared to ask, if he could come back if his mission was successful. It makes you think about, what really inspires people to go above and beyond.
I mean, in that situation, he couldn't really question the formal authority of his commander, but it's like there was something else at play there.
Exactly. Seidman argues that, formal authority, it's transactional. It's about following orders because you have to. But charismatic authority, it comes from shared values and a common vision. It's about believing in the mission and the person who's leading it, even when there's risk involved.
That reminds me of that idea of going to the point of no return. That Seidman describes. He uses this analogy of standing at the edge of a high dive.
Oh, that's such a perfect analogy, It really captures that feeling of knowing you're about to do something scary, but also the feeling that it could be, transformative.
It makes you think about, all the times that maybe you've hesitated or held back from taking a chance maybe at work or in your personal life because of fear.
It's a struggle we all face,
Yeah.
But Seidman's point is that, real leadership, it often demands that we embrace those moments of discomfort. Step off the edge and trust that we'll figure out how to fly on the way down.
He also talks about the difference between motivation and inspiration.
Yeah. He really challenges that classic carrots and sticks approach to motivation, arguing that it's just not sustainable.
Which is interesting because, that approach is still so prevalent in a lot of workplaces.
No, it's deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
But the key difference is that motivation, It comes from external factors, but inspiration comes from within. It's fueled by, a sense of purpose and a connection to values that really resonate with us.
Like Bill Gates and his friends. They were passionate about personal computers long before they became commonplace.
Yeah,
They really believed that PCs had the potential to change the world.
exactly. Their drive and their passion, it stemmed from this deep belief in the significance of their work. It wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about making a difference. And that kind of inspiration, it's contagious.
It makes you wonder, what are we truly passionate about? What inspires us to push ourselves and go that extra mile? You know?
Yeah, that's a question worth exploring. And it often leads to some surprising answers.
Yeah, it really makes you think, huh? Seidman also talks about, the importance of staying true to your principles, even when it's tempting to just be pragmatic. He contrasts, FEMA's response to Hurricane Katrina with, Steve Wynn and that compensation mistake.
Right. Those are two very different situations, but they both highlight, how our choices have long-term consequences.
Yeah.
FEMA, they prioritized speed and efficiency in providing aid after Katrina, but they didn't have a lot of oversight in place, and that ended up leading to widespread fraud and really damaged their credibility.
So it's like good intentions gone wrong in a way.
Exactly. They were trying to help, but their pragmatic approach really backfired. On the other hand, you have Wynn, he took a principled stance even though it was difficult at the time. He understood that, fairness and transparency were core values, and he was willing to take a hit to uphold those values.
And I imagine he probably gained more respect in the long run, by doing that, rather than trying to just sweep it under the rug.
Yeah. Absolutely. Seidman's point is that people can easily spot hypocrisy, especially in this transparent world we live in. Living your values even when it's hard, that's the only way to build authentic trust and a lasting reputation.
Yeah. He also emphasizes, being upfront about the truth, particularly when it's uncomfortable. He uses this example of Jeff Kindler, the former CEO of Pfizer, who is giving this internal video address to his employees.
Oh, yeah. Kindler started his address by using all this vague corporate jargon, about upcoming changes.
Oh, I can picture it now.
Yeah.
All that talk about synergies and streamlining.
Right. But then Kindler kind of caught himself. He realized he wasn't really being truthful about the tough choices that were ahead. So he actually stopped mid-sentence and told his employees directly that there would be cost-cutting measures and layoffs.
Wow, that's pretty brave.
It was. And, although it was undoubtedly difficult for the employees to hear, it also demonstrated Kindler's integrity and his respect for them.
It seems like there's this recurring theme in Seidman's work. This real emphasis on authenticity and transparency, even when it's challenging.
It's a fundamental part of his philosophy, In a how-W world where everything is connected and visible, there's just no place for hiding behind corporate facades or spinning the truth.
Seidman also stresses the need for self-reflection, being aware of our strengths and weaknesses and how those can kind of play out in our interactions with others.
He reminds us that our strengths can also be our weaknesses, depending on the context, Like a lawyer, for example, they might be really good at winning arguments, but that same trait could be detrimental in their personal relationships.
So it's about understanding ourselves well enough to kind of adjust our approach, depending on the situation.
Exactly. Self-awareness is crucial for becoming a self-governing leader. It involves constantly questioning our own assumptions and biases and being open to making adjustments when necessary.
And then he brings back that idea of going to the point of no return. Taking risks that push us beyond our comfort zones. He uses that analogy again of standing at the edge of a high dive.
It's such a powerful image, right? It perfectly captures that feeling of anxiety, but also that sense of possibility,
It makes you think about, all the times that we might have played it safe and held back from taking a chance because of fear.
And Seidman argues that real growth and innovation, they often happen when we're willing to overcome that fear. It's about embracing uncertainty and trusting that we'll figure things out as we go.
And of course, he links all of this back to the importance of, passion and optimism.
Absolutely. Seidman believes that passion fuels everything else. He uses the example of Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks.
Yeah.
He's passionate not just about coffee, but about creating a company culture that's rooted in dignity and respect.
It's about building something meaningful,
Yeah.
not just creating a product.
Exactly. And that passion is infectious. It inspires employees, customers, everyone who comes into contact with it. And ultimately, it's what leads to those extraordinary results.
And what about optimism?
Well, Seidman sees optimism as this powerful force multiplier. It's about having that unwavering belief in your ability to succeed even when you're faced with obstacles.
He even quotes Winston Churchill. I am an optimist. It does not seem too much use being anything else.
That's a great quote, isn't it? Optimism isn't about ignoring challenges or being naive. It's about choosing to focus on possibilities even when things are tough.
And ultimately, Seidman argues that true success comes from pursuing significance, not success itself.
He uses the example of Bill Gates and his early fascination with personal computers. Gates and his friends, they believed that PCs had the potential to change the world, and that belief fueled their passion long before they achieved any financial success.
So it's about connecting to a larger purpose,
Yeah.
Something that goes beyond just personal gain.
Exactly, and that's what gives our work meaning and inspires us to keep pushing forward even when we face challenges.
It's a powerful concept that I think a lot of us can relate to. Yeah, it really is. Seidman's work, it's not just about business, it's about life. It's about how we interact with each other, the values we live by, and how we contribute to something bigger than ourselves. So as we wrap up this deep dive into How W, what are some of the key takeaways that you think we can apply to our own lives?
Well, for me, it starts with that self-awareness, taking that time to really examine our values and motivations and asking ourselves, are we living by those values every day? Are we leading in a way that inspires trust and respect in others?
It's easy to kind of lose sight of the how when we're so focused on the doing.
Yeah, it happens to the best of us.
Yeah.
But Seidman reminds us that, the how is ultimately what matters most. It's the foundation for everything else we build.
I'm also struck by his emphasis on, building those genuine relationships, not just with customers, but with everyone we encounter.
That's a really crucial point. Seidman's entire philosophy is really rooted in the power of connection. He argues that in this hyper-connected world, our relationships are really our most valuable asset.
And those relationships depend on trust and transparency and being authentic.
Exactly.
Right.
It's about being genuine, being willing to be vulnerable, and owning up to our mistakes.
It might not always be easy, but it seems like that's the only way to build something lasting.
I couldn't agree more. And it goes beyond just being good, It's about being effective. Seidman argues that self-governing leaders, they're more innovative, they're more adaptable, and they're more resilient in the face of challenges.
Because they're not afraid to ask those tough questions, to challenge the way things are, and to push for something better.
Exactly. And that inspires others to do the same.
What a powerful vision. It's clear that Seidman's ideas are more relevant now than ever.
Absolutely. His work really offers this roadmap for navigating this complex and constantly changing world that we live in.
Well, this has been such a fascinating deep dive into Seidman's how. I know I'm walking away with a lot to think about.
Me too. His work really challenges us to rethink our assumptions about leadership and what it truly means to be successful.
And for those of you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Seidman's ideas. What resonated with you? How can you apply these concepts to your own life?
And what does it mean for you to pursue significance rather than just success, in your own journey?
That's something for all of us to consider. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of some fascinating ideas.